I stared at my untouched salmon alone at the small corner table, while laughter erupted from the main dining area. My husband's family clinked glasses, shared inside jokes, and passed platters of food among themselves. I was 10 feet away, but might as well have been in another country. When I finally caught Jake's eye, he sauntered over, wineglass in hand. "Why am I sitting by myself?" I asked, my voice barely steady. He glanced back at his parents, then shrugged. "It's just their way, Kelsey." Something inside me snapped after 5 years of trying to belong. I smiled and said, "Perfect. I have my own way too." His eyebrows lifted slightly before he returned to his family, completely missing the steel beneath my words. Jake and I had been married for 5 years. We met at a charity gala, where I was managing the marketing campaign, and he was attending as a guest. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in my work. We connected instantly and were engaged within a year. Our marriage had been mostly happy, though. Jake occasionally dismissed my concerns about various things, especially those involving his family. The Carsons were old money, the kind of wealth that was inherited through generations and maintained through strategic business decisions and advantageous marriages. George Carson, my father-in-law, ran a successful investment firm that had been in the family for 3 generations. Martha, my mother-in-law, was a former debutante who now chaired several prestigious charity boards. Jake's older brother, Paul, worked alongside their father and was married to Diane, who came from a similarly affluent background. They all lived in sprawling homes in Connecticut, attended the same country club, and vacationed in the same exclusive locations. I, on the other hand, grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Pennsylvania. My parents worked hard to put me through college, where I earned a degree in marketing. By the time I met Jake, I had worked my way up to a senior position at a respected agency in New York. I was proud of my accomplishments and financial independence. Jake had initially been impressed by my drive and self-sufficiency qualities that now seemed to irritate his family. From the beginning, the Carsons treated me with a polite but unmistakable coldness. At family gatherings, Martha would introduce me as Jake's wife rather than by my name. George would ask about my job as if it were a cute hobby rather than a career. Paul barely acknowledged my presence, while Diane offered tight-lipped smiles that never reached her eyes. I tried everything to win them over, bringing thoughtful gifts, offering to help with their charity events, expressing interest in their family history. But nothing seemed to thaw the ice. Jake always minimized their behavior. "They're just reserved with newcomers," he'd say. Or, "That's just how they communicate." I wanted to believe him, to believe that eventually they would accept me as part of the family. When I learned about Jake's grandparents' inheritance, I began to understand the family dynamics better. Harold and Eleanor Carson had accumulated significant wealth, which was to be distributed among their descendants. There were complex stipulations about family involvement and unity, and I wondered if the family's attitude toward me was somehow connected to this inheritance. So when the invitation arrived for the annual Carson family vacation at their beach house in the Hamptons, I was genuinely hopeful. A week together might give me the opportunity to finally bond with Jake's family. Perhaps away from the pressures of work and daily life, in a relaxed setting, they might see me differently. This could be a real turning point, I told Jake as I packed my suitcase. "I've taken the whole week off. I really want to make an effort with your family." Jake smiled and squeezed my shoulder. "They'll love you once they get to know you better," he said, though something in his tone sounded hollow. I spent hours shopping for new outfits, wanting to look appropriate without seeming like I was trying too hard. I researched activities in the area, hoping to suggest things we could do as a family. I even prepared a few neutral topics of conversation to avoid any potential arguments. When we arrived at the Hamptons, I gasped at the sight of the Carson beach house. It was more of a mansion, really. 3 stories of weathered gray shingles and white trim with expansive decks overlooking the Atlantic. 6 bedrooms, a chef's kitchen, a library, a game room, and direct beach access. It was the most beautiful vacation home I had ever seen. Martha greeted Jake with a warm embrace. "Darling, you look exhausted. The city is just draining you." She turned to me with a noticeably cooler expression. "Kelsey, I hope the drive wasn't too tiresome for you." "Not at all," I replied brightly. "The house is stunning. Thank you so much for inviting us." Martha merely nodded and gestured toward the stairs. "You and Jake are in the blue room on the 2nd floor. Dinner is at 7. Don't be late." Despite the chilly reception, I remained optimistic. The setting was beautiful, and we had a whole week ahead of us, Surely there would be opportunities to connect. That evening, I put on a navy blue dress that I knew was conservative enough for Martha's taste, applied minimal makeup, and styled my hair in soft waves. Jake whistled appreciatively when I emerged from the bathroom. "You look beautiful," he said, kissing my cheek. "Thank you," I smiled. "I want to make a good impression tonight." We headed downstairs, hand in hand. Paul and Diane had arrived while we were unpacking, and George was mixing cocktails in the living room. Everyone was dressed elegantly but casually, exuding that effortless wealth that had always intimidated me slightly. Manhattan's son George asked Jake, completely ignoring my presence. "Please," Jake replied, dropping my hand to accept the drink. I stood awkwardly, uncertain whether to help Martha in the kitchen or join the men in the living room. Diane sat on a window seat, scrolling through her phone. She glanced up at me briefly before returning her attention to the screen. When the housekeeper announced that dinner was served, I followed the family into the dining room. The table was beautifully set with fine china, crystal glasses, and fresh flowers. I counted the place settings, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and realized there were only 5 chairs at the table. Before I could say anything, Martha turned to me. "Kelsey, I hope you don't mind, but we're a bit cramped at the main table. Would you be a dear and take that small table in the corner? We'll expand the seating tomorrow." I looked at the tiny table set apart from the main dining area. It was the kind of table you might use to serve buffet items, not seat a guest. I turned to Jake, expecting him to object, but he was already pulling out a chair at the main table. "Oh," I said, my voice sounding small even to my own ears. "Of course, that's fine." As I made my way to the isolated table, I noticed there was plenty of room at the main table. In fact, there was an empty chair on the other side. I sat down, feeling a cold wave of realization wash over me. This wasn't about space constraints. They had deliberately set me apart. The pattern continued for 3 more days. At every meal, I was seated at my table, as Martha had begun to call it. The first morning, I had arrived at breakfast to find everyone already eating at the main table. "Good morning," I said, hovering uncertainly. "Morning, Kelsey," Paul replied without looking up from his newspaper. "Coffee's in the pot." "There's your spot," Martha added, gesturing to the same small table from the previous night, now positioned even farther from the main dining area. I looked at Jake, who was buttering a piece of toast. He gave me an apologetic half-smile but said nothing. With each meal, my isolation became more pronounced. The family would talk amongst themselves about people I didn't know, events I hadn't attended, and memories I didn't share. Occasionally, someone would toss a perfunctory question my way. "How's your coffee, Kelsey?" or "Is the weather always this humid in July?" before immediately returning to their private conversation. Jake would sometimes try to include me. Kelsey just finished a huge campaign for that luxury skincare brand he'd offer, but his attempts were quickly derailed. "Speaking of skincare," Martha would interject, turning to Diane, "Did you try that new serum from Dr. Lansing?" And just like that, I was forgotten again. The exclusion extended beyond mealtimes. On the second day, I came downstairs in my swimsuit, eager to join the family on the beach. "Oh, we're actually heading out on the boat," George informed me. "Family tradition. Maybe next time." I watched from the deck as they boarded George's sleek yacht, Jake waving half-heartedly as they pulled away from the dock. I spent the day alone on the beach, alternating between reading and fighting back tears of frustration. The next day, I overheard Martha organizing a shopping trip to some exclusive boutiques in East Hampton. "That sounds fun," I said, entering the kitchen where she was speaking with Diane. "What time are we leaving?" Martha and Diane exchanged glances. "Well, it's really more of a mother-daughter thing," Martha explained, not quite meeting my eyes. "I'm sure you understand." I nodded and retreated the message, clear I was not considered family. That afternoon, while looking for Jake, I stumbled upon a series of framed photographs in the library that I hadn't noticed before. They were clearly from previous family vacations. The Carsons skiing in Aspen, sailing in Greece, on safari in Tanzania. In several recent photos, I spotted Jake, but I was nowhere to be found despite having been on some of those trips. In one photo from a Caribbean vacation the previous year, Jake stood with his arm around his cousin Amy, while I had been cropped out completely. Later that day, I was passing by the sunroom when I overheard Martha speaking to someone on the phone. "Yes, she's still with him," Martha was saying in a low voice. "I don't understand it either. She's from such an ordinary background. No connections, no real refinement. I've tried to be welcoming, but there's only so much one can do with someone who simply doesn't fit." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Was she talking about me? The answer came a moment later. Jake could do so much better than Kelsey. The Patterson girl is divorced now, you know. Old Philadelphia family much more suitable. I'm hoping this week will make him see reason. I backed away silently, my cheeks burning with humiliation. They weren't just excluding me, they were actively trying to end my marriage. That evening, I tried to connect with Diane, thinking she might understand my position as another outsider who had married into the family. I found her alone on the deck, watching the sunset with a glass of wine. Beautiful evening, I said, taking the chair beside her. She agreed noncommittally. Diane, I began hesitantly. I feel like there's something I'm missing here. Has your experience with the family always been welcoming? A flicker of emotion crossed her face, sympathy perhaps, or recognition. For a moment I thought she might confide in me, then her expression shuddered. The Carsons have their ways, she said carefully. It's better to adapt than to fight it. She stood up, smoothing her linen pants. Excuse me, I promised to call the sitter about the kids. Left alone, I contemplated her words. Adapt or fight. Was that really my only choice? And what did adaptation look like to the Carsons? Complete subjugation. The next day brought another painful discovery. I was looking for a book to read in the library when I noticed a guest list on George's desk for a dinner party scheduled for our final night at the beach house. I scanned the names looking for mine next to Jake's. It wasn't there. Jake Carson and guessed the list read, as if we weren't married, as if I were just some random date he might bring along. That night, after another silent, separate dinner, I called my best friend Alyssa from the privacy of the bedroom. They're treating me like I don't exist, Liz, I said, trying to keep my voice down. I'm eating at a separate table. They're planning activities without me. Jake's mother is actively trying to break us up. What does Jake say about all this? Alyssa asked, concern evident in her voice. He keeps saying it's just their way, that I shouldn't take it personally. But how else am I supposed to take it? That's such bull, Kelsey. He should be standing up for you. I know I admitted the words painful to say aloud. I'm starting to think he agrees with them. After hanging up, I broke down. 5 years of trying to be good enough, of making excuses for their behavior, of hoping things would change. It all came crashing down around me. I sobbed into my pillow, feeling utterly alone and betrayed not just by the Carsons but by my own husband. I must have fallen asleep because I woke to the sound of the bedroom door opening. Jake entered carrying his shoes and trying to be quiet. Where were you? I asked, my voice thick from crying. Just having a nightcap with Dad and Paul, he replied, setting his shoes by the closet. I didn't want to wake you. Another exclusion. Another reminder that I wasn't part of their world. The next morning, while Jake was out for a run, I decided to do some exploring. The family was gathered on the main deck, giving me rare access to the house without supervision. I wasn't proud of snooping, but I needed to understand what I was up against. In a drawer of the antique secretary desk in the library, I found a stack of handwritten notes. They appeared to be observations about various family members' spouses dating back several years. With growing horror, I read comments about Paul's first wife, Amanda, too, outspoken at dinner, questioned family tradition, not Carson material, and about George's sister's husband, Lax, proper background, attempting to influence financial decisions, needs to be managed. Then I found notes about me. Kelsey insists on maintaining separate career, shows insufficient deference to family hierarchy, questions tradition, not recommended for full integration. Below that was a separate note in what looked like George's handwriting, standard protocol implemented. Phase 1, isolation. Observe response. My hands trembled as I realized the truth. This wasn't just casual cruelty or snobbery. This was a systematic process, a test that I was deliberately being subjected to. And according to another note, I found Paul's first wife, Amanda, had ultimately failed this test, leading to their divorce. They were trying to break me to drive me away, and from what I could tell, they had succeeded with others before me. That evening, I waited until Jake and I were alone in our bedroom before confronting him. I found some interesting notes in your father's desk today, I said, my voice calmer than I felt. Jake, who had been scrolling through emails on his phone, looked up sharply. You went through my father's desk. That's your concern, not what I found. I pulled the folded papers from my pocket. Care to explain what standard protocol and isolation phase mean in relation to your wife? Jake's expression shifted from anger to resignation. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed. It's just a family thing, Kelsey. They did it to everyone who married in. It's a sort of test. A test, I repeated incredulously. humiliating me, isolating me, talking about me behind my back. That's a test. You're being too sensitive, Jake said, his tone dismissive. They did the same thing to Diane, to my Uncle Bill's wife, to everyone. It's how they determine who's committed to the family, or willing to be a doormat. I was nearly shouting now. And what about Amanda Paul's first wife? Did they drive her away too? Jake's silence was answer enough. Why didn't you warn me? I demanded. Why didn't you stand up for me? Look, Jake said with a sigh. My family has certain expectations. They've never thought you were quite right for me. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not right for you. What does that mean? You know what it means, Kelsey. You don't come from our world. You insist on working when you don't need to. You question traditions that have been in place for generations. So this whole week has been what? Them trying to show you that you married beneath you, and you've just been going along with it. That's not fair, Jake protested weakly. Not fair, not fair. I was trembling with rage now. I've spent 5 years trying to fit into your family. 5 years of snubs and dismissals and cold shoulders. 5 years of you telling me it would get better, that they just needed time. And all along you've known they were doing this deliberately, that they never intended to accept me. Jake stood up, his own anger rising. You're blowing this out of proportion. If you just try harder to fit in, to understand our ways, your ways are cruel and elitist and manipulative. I stepped closer to him, looking him directly in the eyes. And the worst part is, you're just like them. You've been playing both sides this whole time, pretending to support me while actually agreeing with them. That's not true, Jake said, but he couldn't hold my gaze. Tell me honestly, Jake. Do you think I'm good enough for you? Do you respect me, my background, my career, my values? His hesitation told me everything I needed to know. I think we should sleep separately tonight, I said, my voice flat. You can have the couch downstairs. After Jake left with a pillow and blanket, I sat on the edge of the bed, too numb to cry. The man I had loved, had built a life with, had never truly respected me. He had allowed his family to deliberately hurt me as some sort of twisted loyalty test. And he had failed me in the most fundamental way a spouse could. The next morning I decided to confront Martha directly. I found her in the garden, directing the gardener about some rose bushes. Could we talk for a moment? I asked, when the gardener had moved to another part of the garden. Martha looked surprised, but nodded. Of course, dear. What is it? I'd like to understand why I'm being treated like an unwelcome stranger on this vacation. Her surprise seemed genuine. I'm not sure what you mean. The separate table, the exclusion from family activities, the whispered conversations that stop when I enter a room. I kept my voice level. I found the notes, Martha. I know this is a deliberate test. Martha's expression hardened. I see. Well, since we're being direct, I'll be direct as well. The Carson family has certain standards, Kelsey. Standards that, frankly, you don't meet. Despite expecting this response, her words still stung. Standards based on what? My background, my career, the fact that I don't blindly accept everything without question. Call it what you will, Martha said, with a dismissive wave. The fact remains that you haven't made the effort to truly become part of this family. You maintain your separate identity, your separate career. That's not how things work here. And you've been pushing Jake to consider divorce, I added, recalling her phone conversation. Martha didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed. I've merely pointed out that he had other options, better matches. It's not too late for him to correct his mistake. His mistake, is that what I am to you? My dear, Martha said with false sweetness, you must have known from the beginning that you weren't Carson material. Jake was simply distracted by your novelty. But marriages in our circle are about more than just attraction. They're alliances, partnerships that strengthen family positions. What do you bring to that equation? I wanted to list my accomplishments, my character, my love for her son, but I realized it would be pointless. Nothing I could say would change her mind. Thank you for your honesty, I said instead, turning to leave. Kelsey, Martha called after me. If you truly love Jake, you'll consider what's best for him. And that might not be you. I spent the rest of the day avoiding the family, walking on the beach, and trying to make sense of my shattered world. When I returned to the house in the late afternoon, I overheard voices from George's study. The door was ajar, and I recognized Jake's voice. I don't know what to do, Dad. She found the notes. She knows about the test. And how did she respond? George's deep voice asked. She's angry, says we've been cruel. There was a sigh that I assumed came from George. This is exactly why we do this, son. A true Carson spouse understands discretion, tradition, the way things are done. They don't go snooping through private papers or making scenes. I know, Dad, but she's my wife. I do care about her. The question is whether she's the right wife. Your mother tells me Eliza Patterson is available again. Now there's a woman who understands our world. Eliza, we dated in college, and she would have made an excellent match. It's not too late, you know. The papers could be filed quietly. We have the prenup to protect your assets. My heart pounded in my ears. They were actively planning the end of my marriage. I don't know, Jake said, sounding torn. Kelsey has her good points. She's smart, hardworking, but fundamentally unsuitable. George finished for him. Son, you know your mother and I only want what's best for you for the family. Kelsey simply doesn't fit. She never will. You must see that by now. There was a long pause. I guess you're right, Jake finally said so quietly I almost missed it. She doesn't really understand our world. And lately she's been so focused on her career, talking about wanting a partnership instead of just supporting me. I backed away from the door, not wanting to hear any more. Jake wasn't just failing to defend me. He was actively participating in discussions about replacing me with someone more suitable. In a daze, I wandered back to our room. As I was changing for dinner, another meal where I would sit alone while they discussed my replacement, I noticed Jake's briefcase by the desk. It was partially open and I could see a manila folder labeled Personal, Confidential. I hesitated only briefly before pulling it out. Inside were documents from a law firm specializing in high net worth divorces. There were notes about asset division, about the enforceability of our prenuptial agreement, about strategies for minimizing settlements. But what truly chilled me was a bank statement showing transfers from our joint account to one I didn't recognize. Jake had been moving money, our money, into an account under his name only. Preparing financially for our separation, the final betrayal. While smiling to my face and sharing my bed, my husband had been planning his exit strategy, preparing to leave me with as little as possible. I carefully replaced the documents, my mind racing. I had been naive, trusting, willing to blame myself for the problems in our marriage and in my relationship with his family. But now I saw the truth with painful clarity. I wasn't the problem. I never had been. I was simply inconvenient to their plans, an obstacle to be removed. Well, if they wanted to play games, they would soon discover I was an opponent worthy of their respect. It was time to stop trying to fit into their world and start protecting myself. I waited until Jake was in the shower before making a call to my friend Taylor, an attorney who specialized in family law. I need emergency advice, I said quietly, sitting on the balcony where I wouldn't be overheard. My husband is planning to divorce me and hiding assets. I just found the documentation. Whoa, Kelsey, slow down, Taylor said, her professional persona immediately taking over. First, don't confront him yet. You need to gather evidence. Can you take photos of what you found? Yes, I whispered. I can do that when he's not around. Good. Now do you have access to your own funds, accounts he can't touch? I thought about my personal savings account that I had maintained throughout our marriage against Jake's wishes. He had always argued that we should combine everything, but something had made me keep this financial independence. Yes, I have my own account. It's not huge, but it's something. Transfer whatever you can to it immediately, but be careful not to empty joint accounts completely. That could look suspicious. Taylor's voice was calm and methodical. Are you somewhere safe? Do you need to leave? I'm on vacation with his family, I said with a bitter laugh. The same family that's been systematically trying to drive me away for 5 years. But no, I'm not in physical danger. This is more psychological warfare. Psychological abuse is still abuse, Kelsey Taylor said firmly. Document everything they say and do, dates, times, witnesses. It could be relevant later. We spoke for a few more minutes, with Taylor outlining the immediate steps I should take to protect myself legally and financially. When I hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in days, a sense of purpose, of control. The water in the bathroom had stopped running. I composed myself, wiping away any trace of tears, and plastered on a neutral expression just as Jake emerged with a towel around his waist. You look deep in thought, he commented, opening a drawer to retrieve clothes. Just thinking about dinner, I replied smoothly. Another exciting evening at my special table. Jake had the decency to look uncomfortable. Look, I'm sorry about that. It's just their way. I know I finished for him. Don't worry about it, Jake. I'm getting used to it. He seemed relieved by my apparent acceptance, missing entirely the determination that had replaced my earlier despair. Over the next 2 days, I implemented my plan with careful precision. While maintaining a subdued, almost defeated exterior, I was secretly documenting everything. When Jake went for his morning run with Paul, I photographed the financial documents in his briefcase. During family outings that I was conveniently excluded from, I transferred money to my personal account in amounts that wouldn't raise immediate red flags. I discovered more than I had bargained for while investigating the Carson family business. Using my marketing research skills, I found articles mentioning Carson investments in connection with some questionable practices. Nothing explicitly illegal, but certainly ethically dubious. I saved these along with public records showing the company's involvement with controversial clients. The family's public reputation, I realized, was incredibly important to them. George and Martha were pillars of society, their philanthropic efforts widely praised. Jake was being groomed to eventually take over the company, his image carefully cultivated as a responsible, ethical businessman. How would it look if their treatment of family members became public knowledge? If their private cruelty contradicted their public personas? I began to pay closer attention to the house staff, the housekeeper Maria, the gardener Thomas, the chef Antoine. They had witnessed the family's behavior toward me and others before me. I made a point to be kind to them, to learn about their lives, to treat them with the respect the Carsons rarely showed. In return, they began to open up to me. They did the same to Mr. Paul's first wife, Maria, confided when I helped her fold laundry one afternoon. Miss Amanda was a lovely woman, but they broke her spirit, made her feel so small until she left. And before her, I asked casually, "Oh, many others. Mr. George's sister's husband didn't last a year. Mrs. Martha's brother's first wife, she tried to fight back. They made sure she got nothing in the divorce." This information was valuable, but I needed more. On the pretext of needing to buy toiletries, I took a taxi into town the next day and used the opportunity to meet with a local attorney recommended by Taylor. He confirmed what I suspected, that Jake's financial maneuvers were potentially actionable, and that I had grounds to challenge the prenuptial agreement given the circumstances. But the most significant discovery came on the 6th day of our vacation. While the family was having drinks on the deck, I overheard a conversation that changed everything. "Is everything ready for Saturday's announcement?" Martha asked George in a low voice. "All set," George replied. "The board approved it yesterday. Jake will officially be announced as the new CEO at the dinner. Carson Investments enters its next generation of leadership." "Perfect timing," Martha said with satisfaction, "with the Patterson girl there to see it. I've seated her next to Jake at dinner." "What about the wife?" George asked, and I could hear the disdain in his voice without having to see his face. "She won't be attending, of course. I've told her it's executives only. She didn't even question it." They were planning to announce Jake's promotion to CEO at the final dinner party, the one I had been explicitly excluded from. And they had invited his ex-girlfriend, the suitable Eliza Patterson, to witness his triumph. No wonder they had been so determined to undermine me this week. They wanted me gone before Jake ascended to his new position, replaced by someone they deemed worthy of being a CEO's wife. I slipped away before they could notice me, my mind racing with new possibilities. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about their pattern of behavior, about the way they used and discarded people who didn't serve their purposes, about the cruelty that lay beneath their polished exterior, and I now had the leverage to expose it all. With this new information, my plan evolved from simple self-protection to something more comprehensive. I wasn't just going to walk away with my dignity intact. I was going to ensure the Carsons never did this to anyone else again. First, I needed to secure my financial future. Using the information Taylor had provided, I arranged for protection of my assets, transferring what I legitimately could to accounts Jake couldn't access. I documented the transfers Jake had already made, building evidence of his attempt to hide marital assets. Next, I reached out to Diane again, this time with a different approach. I found her alone in the library reading a novel. "Can I join you?" I asked quietly. She looked up, surprised, but nodded. I sat across from her. "Diane, I know we're not close, but I think we might have more in common than you realize. The separate table, the exclusion from activities, the whispered comments. They did it to you too, didn't they?" Diane's face paled. She glanced toward the door before answering. "How did you know?" "I found the notes. It's their standard protocol, apparently." She closed her book, her hands trembling slightly. I was tested for almost a year. It was brutal. But you passed, I observed. I surrendered, she corrected me, her voice barely audible. I gave up my career, my friends, my identity. I became what they wanted, the perfect Carson wife. Silent, supportive, invisible when necessary. And are you happy, Diane? Her eyes filled with tears. What do you think? This conversation confirmed what I had suspected. Diane wasn't an ally of the family. She was another victim who had chosen compliance as her survival strategy. What about Amanda? I asked. Paul's first wife. Diane's expression darkened. Amanda fought back. She refused to be molded into their idea of a proper wife, so they destroyed her. Paul filed for divorce, claiming she was unstable. The prenup left her with almost nothing. Last I heard, she had moved back to Chicago. Do you have her contact information? Diane hesitated. Kelsey, what are you planning? I'm not sure yet, I answered truthfully. But I know I can't stay in this marriage, and I won't let them treat me the way they treated Amanda. After a long moment, Diane wrote down a phone number on a slip of paper. Be careful, she warned. They're more powerful than you know. With Diane's help, I was able to contact not just Amanda but several other former family members who had been subjected to the Carson test. Each had a similar story: isolation, humiliation, psychological manipulation. Some, like Diane, had surrendered their autonomy to remain in the family. Others had left or been forced out, often with financial repercussions. Most importantly, I learned about a condition in the family trust established by Jake's grandparents. Harold and Eleanor Carson had created the trust with specific language about family unity and ethical behavior. There were provisions that could potentially restrict access to funds if beneficiaries were found to be acting in ways contrary to these values. This was my strongest leverage. If Jake's grandparents, particularly his grandmother Eleanor, who was still alive, learned how the family had been behaving, it could jeopardize their control over the family fortune. I carefully prepared documentation of everything I had learned: the systematic mistreatment of in-laws, the financial misconduct, the questionable business practices. I organized it all in a secure cloud folder, accessible only with a password, ready to be shared if necessary. On the 7th day of our vacation, the situation escalated dramatically. Jake confronted me in our room after returning from a golf outing with his father and brother. You met with a lawyer in town, he said without preamble. I looked up from my book, surprised by his directness. How do you know that? Small towns, small world. George plays golf with the partner of the firm. Jake's expression was a mixture of anger and something else. Fear, perhaps. What the hell are you doing, Kelsey? Protecting myself, I replied calmly, closing my book. The same way you've been protecting yourself by moving money out of our joint accounts. His face flushed. You went through my private papers. And you've been planning to divorce me behind my back, I countered. While allowing your family to systematically humiliate me as some sort of twisted tradition. It's not like that, Jake protested, but the conviction in his voice was weak. Then what is it like, Jake? Explain it to me. Explain why your mother is inviting your ex-girlfriend to the dinner announcing your CEO position. A dinner I've been explicitly excluded from. His eyes widened in surprise. How did you know about that? The same way I know about all the other spouses your family has tested and discarded. The same way I know about the conditions in your grandparents' trust regarding family unity and ethical behavior. I stood up, facing him directly. I've done my research, Jake. I know more than you think. Jake ran a hand through his hair, visibly rattled. What exactly do you want, Kelsey? I wanted a husband who respected me, a family that accepted me. But since that's clearly impossible, I'll settle for a fair divorce and the assurance that your family never does this to anyone else. Are you threatening me? Us. Jake's voice rose in disbelief. I'm simply telling you that actions have consequences. Your family has hurt a lot of people. That stops now. Jake paced the room, agitation clear in every movement. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Kelsey. My family has connections, resources. If you try to fight us, then what? I interrupted. You'll destroy me like you did Amanda. Leave me with nothing. Make sure I never work in my industry again. I shook my head. I'm not Amanda, Jake. I've documented everything. If anything happens to me or my reputation, it all comes out. We stared at each other across the room, the years of our marriage dissolving in the face of this raw confrontation. You have a choice to make, Jake finally said, his voice cold. You can accept your place in this family and we can move forward. Or you can continue with whatever this is and face the consequences. My place, I repeated. You mean the separate table, the constant disrespect. Being treated as less than human because I don't have the right pedigree. It's just their way, Kelsey, Jake exploded. Why can't you accept that and adapt like everyone else? And there it was, the fundamental problem that had plagued our marriage from the beginning. Jake believed I should change to accommodate his family's cruelty. That their way was more important than my dignity, my identity, my worth as a human being. You're right, Jake, I said softly. It is their way. And I have my own way, too. Jake left shortly after slamming the door behind him. I sat on the edge of the bed, trembling slightly, but resolute. The confrontation had clarified everything for me. There was no going back, no possibility of reconciliation. All that remained was to implement the final phase of my plan. That evening, I dressed carefully for dinner, knowing it would likely be my last at the Carson Beach House. I wore a simple black dress, elegant but understated, and kept my makeup minimal. When I arrived in the dining room, Martha was directing the staff about place settings. Your table is set up by the window tonight, Kelsey, she said without looking at me. Actually, Martha, I said pleasantly, I think I'll join the family tonight. She turned to me, surprise evident on her face. I don't think that's necessary, maybe not, but it's what I'm doing. I moved toward the main table and pulled out a chair next to Jake's place setting. Martha's lips thinned into a tight line, but before she could respond, the others began to enter the dining room. Jake looked between his mother and me, clearly sensing the tension. Problem, he asked casually, though I could see the warning in his eyes. Kelsey seems to think she's joining us at the main table tonight, Martha said, her voice sharp with disapproval. I see, Jake said. He hesitated for a moment, torn between his mother and his wife. Then, to my bitter disappointment, but not my surprise, he said, Mom's arranged the seating very specifically, Kelsey. It's just easier if you sit at your usual spot. I remained standing as George and Paul entered with their pre-dinner scotches, followed by Diane. They all registered the standoff with varying degrees of interest. Is something wrong? George asked, his tone suggesting that whatever it was, it had better be resolved quickly and quietly. Nothing's wrong, Jake said hastily. Kelsey was just going to her table. I looked around at all of them. George's impatience, Martha's smug certainty, Paul's indifference, Diane's carefully masked sympathy, and Jake's cowardice. 5 days of isolation, years of subtle cruelty. A lifetime of this to look forward to if I stayed. Actually, I said calmly, I was just asking Jake why I've been seated separately all week. He explained that it's just your way. I smiled, making direct eye contact with each of them in turn. And I told him that's perfect because I have my own way too. With that, I walked to my separate table, feeling their eyes on my back. I could almost hear their silent sighs of relief, their assumption that I had finally accepted my place. Little did they know that my acquiescence was merely the calm before the storm I was about to unleash. The next morning, I rose early and slipped out of the house before anyone else was awake. I had made arrangements the previous day, and a taxi was waiting at the end of the long driveway to take me to my destination. Westbrook Manor was an elegant colonial estate about 30 minutes from the Carson Beach House. As the taxi pulled through the gates, I admired the manicured gardens and stately architecture. This was old money, even older than the Carsons. I had called ahead, and I was expected. A butler led me through the house to a sunroom overlooking the gardens where an elegant woman in her 80s sat reading the financial section of the newspaper. Mrs. Carson, I said as I entered the room. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Eleanor Carson looked up, her blue eyes, so like Jake's, sharp and assessing. Kelsey. After 5 years of marriage to my grandson, it's about time we met. She gestured to the chair opposite her. Please sit, and call me Eleanor. I understand you have something important to discuss. As I sat down, I studied the woman who had co-founded the Carson fortune with her late husband. Despite her age, she exuded strength and intelligence. This was someone who commanded respect. Not through intimidation like her son George, but through genuine authority. I'll be direct, Eleanor, I began. I'm here because I'm concerned about behaviors in the family that I believe would deeply disturb you and go against the values you and your husband established. I proceeded to explain everything: the testing of new family members, the deliberate isolation, the psychological manipulation, the discarding of those who failed to adapt. I showed her the notes I had found, the documented pattern of behavior across multiple in-laws. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grave. When I finished, she removed her reading glasses and set them aside. I was aware that George and Martha could be particular about who joined the family, she said slowly. But I had no idea they had systematized this cruelty. That they were using the family resources to pressure and control people in this way. There's more, I said, pulling out copies of the financial documents I had gathered. Jake has been moving assets in preparation for divorcing me, and there are questions about some of the business practices at Carson Investments. Eleanor examined the documents, her mouth setting into a firm line. This is not what Harold and I intended when we established the trust or the company. Not at all. She looked up at me. Why are you bringing this to me rather than simply leaving? Many would have done so by now. 2 reasons, I replied honestly. First, I want to ensure that this doesn't happen to anyone else. The cycle needs to end. And second, I believe in accountability. What they've done, not just to me but to others before me, shouldn't go unanswered. Eleanor nodded slowly. I agree. And I thank you for having the courage to bring this to me directly. She reached for the phone on the table beside her. If you'll excuse me, I need to make a few calls. And then I think we should pay a visit to the beach house. 2 hours later, I sat in the passenger seat of Eleanor's Bentley as her driver navigated the coastal road to the Carson Beach House. We had spent the morning making arrangements, Eleanor moving with decisive efficiency once she understood the situation. I want to be clear about something, Kelsey, Eleanor said as we approached the house. This isn't just about punishing George and Martha or even about your marriage to Jake. This is about restoring the values that the Carson family was built upon. Integrity, fairness, genuine respect for others. Somewhere along the way, George lost sight of those values. I nodded, understanding. I know this must be painful for you. Less painful than allowing this behavior to continue, she replied firmly. When we arrived at the beach house, the family was gathered on the deck for lunch. I watched their expressions change from surprise to confusion to alarm as they recognized who was accompanying me. Mother George said, rising quickly from his chair. This is unexpected. We had no idea you were coming. Clearly, Eleanor replied dryly. I find there are quite a few things you haven't made me aware of, George. Martha hurried forward, casting a suspicious glance at me. Eleanor, what a lovely surprise. You should have called. We would have prepared properly for your arrival. I preferred to see things as they truly are, not as you would prepare them for my benefit, Eleanor said. Her gaze swept over the group, lingering on Jake, who looked distinctly uncomfortable. I understand you've been conducting some sort of testing program for new family members. Perhaps you'd care to explain that to me. A heavy silence fell over the deck. George and Martha exchanged alarmed glances. I'm not sure what you've heard, Mother George began carefully, but I assure you, we simply have standards for those who join the family. As you and Father always did. Don't you dare invoke your father's name to justify cruelty, Eleanor said, her voice sharp with authority. Harold and I welcomed new members into this family with open arms. We understood that diversity of background and thought made us stronger, not weaker. With all due respect, Mother, times have changed, George argued. The family's position needs to be protected. And you think the way to do that is by forcing people to sit at separate tables? By excluding them from family activities? By driving away anyone who doesn't conform to your narrow definition of acceptable? Eleanor shook her head in disgust. You've twisted everything your father and I built. As George attempted to defend himself, I noticed Jake moving toward me. What have you done? He hissed under his breath. What you should have done, I replied quietly. Protected the vulnerable from the powerful. Stood up against cruelty. Been a decent human being. The confrontation continued, with Eleanor methodically addressing each aspect of the family's behavior. She had brought copies of the trust documents, pointing out specific clauses about family unity and ethical conduct. As the surviving trustee, I have both the authority and the responsibility to ensure these conditions are met, she informed them. Based on what I've learned today, I will be re-evaluating the distribution of trust assets and the leadership of Carson Investments. At this, George paled visibly. Mother, you can't be serious. The announcement dinner is tonight. The board has already approved Jake's appointment as CEO. The board serves at my pleasure, George, as do you. Eleanor's voice was steel wrapped in velvet, and I am very serious. The dynamic had shifted completely. The mighty Carsons, who had wielded such power over me and others, now looked small and defensive under Eleanor's condemning gaze. But the true shock was yet to come. As the confrontation reached its peak, The sound of cars arriving drew everyone's attention to the driveway. One by one, people began to emerge. Men and women of various ages, all strangers to me. "What is this?" Martha demanded, looking increasingly alarmed. "These," Eleanor said with quiet authority, "are the people your family has hurt over the years. Former spouses who were tested and discarded. In-laws who were driven away for not conforming to your expectations." I recognized Amanda from photographs, now stepping onto the deck with determined dignity. Behind her came others whose names I had learned from my research. Jake's uncle's ex-wife, Stephanie George's, sister's former husband David Cousins, and their partners who had been subjected to similar treatment. "I've invited them here today." Eleanor continued to ensure that the full pattern of behavior is acknowledged. No more secrets, no more private cruelty masked by public respectability. The color drained from Martha's face as she recognized some of the arrivals. "This is outrageous. You have no right to bring these people here. They're not family anymore." "That's where you're wrong," Martha Eleanor said. "They were family. They were simply not treated as such. And that ends today." As the newcomers gathered on the deck, years of suppressed truth began to emerge. Amanda described her systematic isolation by Paul and his parents. David recounted how his career had been sabotaged when he refused to give up his independence. Others shared similar stories, each one adding to the overwhelming evidence of the family's pattern of psychological abuse. Jake stood apart, his expression, a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension, as he truly understood, perhaps for the first time, the system he had been complicit in. When his eyes met mine, I saw something I had never expected. Shame. "Kelsey," he said, approaching me, as the others continued their discussions. "I had no idea. I knew about the testing, but I didn't realize how cruel it was." I finished for him. "How it made people feel, or that it was wrong." "All of it," he admitted. "I just accepted it as normal because it was all I knew. The family way." "That's the problem, Jake. You never questioned it. Never stood back and asked if it was right. And when I was hurting, when I needed you to protect me, you chose them. Every single time." He flinched at the truth in my words. "Can we? Is there any way to fix this? To fix us?" I looked at him, really looked at the man I had married, had loved, had built a life with. And I knew with absolute certainty that there was no going back. "No, Jake. Some things can't be fixed once they're broken, but we can end them with dignity." As the afternoon wore on the beach house, that had been the site of so much quiet cruelty, became a place of reckoning and perhaps healing. Eleanor moved among the gathered former family members, listening to their stories with genuine concern and apologizing for what they had endured in the name of the Carson family. George and Martha retreated into angry silence, occasionally attempting to justify their behavior but finding no support even from Paul, who seemed genuinely shaken by Amanda's account of their marriage. And I, who had arrived at this vacation a hopeful wife and would leave it preparing for divorce, felt a strange sense of peace. The truth was finally exposed to the light. Justice in its way was being served, and I had found my voice, my strength, and my way forward, without the Carsons. The gathering at the beach house continued into the early evening. Eleanor had taken charge completely, her authority unquestioned, even by George. The dinner party that had been planned to announce Jake's CEO position was canceled, the caterers repurposed to serve the unexpected assembly of current and former family members. The dynamic was fascinating to watch. Initially awkward and tense, the atmosphere gradually shifted as people shared their experiences. Alliances formed across unexpected lines. Diane, finally free to speak her truth, described her own testing period and the parts of herself she had sacrificed to be accepted. "I gave up my career in interior design," she told the group, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I stopped seeing friends who weren't appropriate. I changed how I dressed, how I spoke, even what I thought, and for what to be tolerated rather than valued." Paul, listening to his wife with growing horror, moved to sit beside her. "I had no idea you felt that way," he said quietly. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "Because that wasn't allowed," Diane replied simply. "Questioning wasn't permitted. Dissent wasn't tolerated. So I stopped questioning, stopped dissenting, until I almost forgot how." Similar revelations echoed around the deck as the sun began to set over the Atlantic. The Carson facade of perfect family unity was crumbling, replaced by something messier but far more authentic: actual human connection. Eleanor had been consulting with her attorneys throughout the day, and as evening approached, she called for everyone's attention. I want to thank you all for your courage in coming here today and sharing your experiences. She began, her voice clear and strong despite her age. What happened to each of you was wrong. The Carson family that my husband and I built was meant to be a source of support and love, not manipulation and cruelty. She turned to George and Martha, who sat stiffly at the edge of the group. As trustee of the Carson Family Trust, I am implementing immediate changes. The testing of family members ends today. The trust will be restructured to ensure that power cannot be concentrated in ways that enable abuse. George started to protest, but Eleanor silenced him with a raised hand. Additionally, the leadership of Carson Investments will be reevaluated. George, you and the board will meet with me next week to discuss the future direction of the company and its governance. She then addressed the wider group. To those who were harmed by these practices, I offer not just my apology but my commitment to making amends. My attorneys will be contacting each of you to discuss appropriate compensation for the professional and personal damages you suffered. Amanda, who had been quiet for much of the gathering, finally spoke up. I don't want their money, Eleanor. I just wanted acknowledgement that what happened wasn't right, that it wasn't my failure. Eleanor nodded. And you deserved that acknowledgement years ago. Whatever form the amends take, they will be offered with respect for your wishes. As the formal part of the gathering concluded, people broke into smaller groups. I found myself approached by Jake, who had been uncharacteristically subdued throughout the day. Can we talk? He asked, gesturing toward the beach. Just for a few minutes. I hesitated, then nodded. We walked in silence down the wooden steps to the shore, the rhythm of the waves providing a soothing backdrop to what we both knew would be a difficult conversation. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, Jake began when we were out of earshot of the others. About me never questioning the family way. You were right. I just accepted it all. The hierarchy, the rules, the treatment of outsiders. Because it was what I knew. That's part of the problem, Jake, but not all of it, I said, watching the waves rather than his face. You knew I was suffering. You saw it. And you chose to ignore it because acknowledging it would have meant standing up to your family. I was a coward, he admitted. I told myself I was caught in the middle, that there was nothing I could do, but the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of losing my place in the family, my inheritance, my position at the company. I put all of that above you, above our marriage, above basic human decency. His honesty surprised me. It was perhaps the most genuine thing he had said to me in years. Thank you for acknowledging that, I said softly. I know it's too late for us, Jake continued. I know I've broken something that can't be fixed. But I want you to know that I see it now. What they did, what I did. And I'm sorry, Kelsey. Truly sorry. I finally turned to look at him, this man who had been the center of my world for 5 years. There was real pain in his eyes, real regret. But there was also the unmistakable evidence of who he was at his core, someone who had participated in cruelty because it was easier than standing against it. I accept your apology, Jake, I said, and I hope this experience changes you, makes you question and challenge the things you've been taught. But you're right, it is too late for us. I'm filing for divorce as soon as we return to the city. Jake nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I understand. For what it's worth, I won't contest it. Whatever you want in the settlement, it's yours. It's the least I can do. I don't want to punish you, Jake. I just want what's fair. And most of all, I want to move on with my life. To find people who value me for who I am, not who they want me to be. We stood for a moment longer, the waves washing away our footprints in the sand, a fitting metaphor for the impermanence of what we had built together. As we returned to the house, I noticed Diane deep in conversation with Eleanor. Paul stood nearby, looking thoughtful rather than angry. Martha was nowhere to be seen, and George was speaking with one of Eleanor's attorneys, his usual confidence notably diminished. Kelsey, Eleanor called, waving me over. We were just discussing practical arrangements. Will you be staying at the beach house tonight? I hadn't considered the immediate logistics. The thought of spending another night under the same roof as the Carsons, even with Eleanor present, was unappealing. I'd rather not, I admitted, but I don't have anywhere else to go locally. Nonsense, Eleanor said firmly. You'll stay with me at Westbrook. My driver can take you to collect your things and Jake can have them brought down. Jake, who had followed me up from the beach, nodded in agreement. I'll pack everything for you. Within an hour, I had gathered my personal belongings and was preparing to leave the Carson beach house for the last time. As I stood in the entryway, suitcase beside me, I felt an unexpected sense of freedom. The weight of trying to belong in a family that would never accept me, of dimming my light to avoid outshining others, of constantly second-guessing myself, it was all lifting. One by one, the others came to say goodbye. Diane hugged me tightly, whispering, "Thank you for being braver than I was." Amanda shook my hand and said simply, "Well done." Even Paul offered an awkward but seemingly genuine apology for his role in my mistreatment. Jake was the last to approach me. "I'll have my lawyer contact yours when we get back to the city," he said, "to start the divorce proceedings." "Thank you," I replied. "I hope you find your way forward, Jake. A way that's truly yours, not your family's." He nodded, his expression somber. "I hope so too." As Eleanor's car pulled away from the beach house, I didn't look back. That chapter of my life was closing and a new one was beginning. The following year brought profound changes. The divorce was finalized with surprising efficiency, Jake keeping to his word about not contesting anything. I received a fair settlement that allowed me to start fresh, including buying a small but beautiful apartment in Brooklyn. My career flourished as I poured my energy into work that truly fulfilled me. I eventually started my own marketing consultancy, specializing in helping small businesses with authentic branding, the antithesis of the image-obsessed world I had left behind. I stayed in touch with Diane, who had begun the difficult process of reclaiming her identity. She had reopened her interior design studio and was rebuilding relationships with friends she had abandoned during her marriage. She and Paul were in counseling, their future uncertain, but at least based on truth now rather than pretense. Eleanor became an unexpected ally and friend. Under her leadership, the Carson family was slowly transforming. The toxic traditions were dismantled, and new, healthier patterns were being established. George and Martha resisted at first, but eventually recognized that their power had limits, especially when Eleanor made clear the financial consequences of continued resistance. Jake, I heard through Diane, had declined the CEO position and instead taken a sabbatical to reevaluate his priorities, as he put it. Part of me hoped he would find his way to becoming the person I had once believed him to be, but that was his journey now, not mine. Exactly 1 year after that fateful vacation, I hosted a dinner party in my new home. Around my table sat the family I had chosen. My parents, who had flown in from Pennsylvania, my best friend Alyssa, colleagues who had become friends, neighbors, who had welcomed me to my new building, even Diane, who had come into the city for the weekend. As we shared a meal prepared with love rather than pretension, passed dishes to one another rather than being served by staff, and laughed genuinely rather than performatively, I realized how far I had come. From the woman seated alone at a separate table, isolated and diminished, to the host of my own gathering, surrounded by people who valued me for exactly who I was. "I'd like to make a toast," I said, raising my glass. Everyone quieted, turning to me with warm smiles. "To found family, the people who see us, hear us, and love us, not despite our differences, but because of them. And to the courage to walk away from situations that dim our light, even when staying seems easier." "Hear, hear," came the response, glasses clinking around the table. Later, as the last guests were leaving, Alyssa hung back. "You seem different, Kelsey," she observed. "Lighter somehow. Happier." "I am," I replied, realizing the truth of it as I spoke. I spent so long trying to belong somewhere I was never meant to fit. Now I've created a place where I belong just as I am, where we all belong as we are. "That's the lesson, isn't it?" Alyssa said thoughtfully. "That sometimes the greatest strength is walking away with your dignity intact rather than staying and losing yourself piece by piece." I nodded, thinking of the woman I had been a year ago and the woman I was now. Exactly. And that true family, whether born or chosen, lifts you up rather than tears you down. It expands to include rather than contracts to exclude. It celebrates difference rather than punishing it. As I closed the door behind my friend and looked around my home, modest compared to the Carson Beach house, but filled with warmth and authenticity, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had led me here. The pain had been real, the betrayal deep, but they had ultimately guided me to a life of genuine connection, self-respect, and joy. Sometimes I reflected, you have to sit at the separate table to realize you deserve a place at a better one, and sometimes you have to create that table yourself. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have stayed and tried to adapt to the Carson family's way, or would you have found the courage to walk away? I hope you never find yourself isolated at a separate table, but if you do, remember that you deserve to be seen, heard, and valued, exactly as you are. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, comment, and share with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for listening, and I wish you the strength to always honor your true self even when it means walking a harder path.